There is a specific kind of loneliness that no one talks about. Not the loneliness of being alone in a room, but the loneliness of being surrounded by people who are looking directly at what you see and choosing not to see it. You felt it. That moment when something becomes obvious to you, a pattern, a truth, a crack in the surface of something everyone else is treating as solid, and you open your mouth and the room looks at you like you just spoke in a language they don't recognize. And then, slowly, you learn. You learn to be quiet. You learn to second guess. You learn to perform the blindness they're comfortable with. And somewhere in that process, something in you starts to break. This isn't about being smarter than other people. That framing is a trap. And if you jumped to it, notice that. This is about something far more uncomfortable. The psychological cost of perception itself. What happens to a person who sees clearly in a world that is organized, socially and emotionally, around the mutual agreement to not see? What does it do to your identity, your relationships, your sense of reality, when the thing you perceive most clearly is the thing everyone around you is most invested in denying? Otto Rank spent his life studying what he called the artist type, the person whose sensitivity to reality exceeds what their social environment can absorb. He didn't describe it as a gift. He described it as a wound that either destroys you or becomes the very material you build yourself from. The question this video is asking is not whether you see what others don't. You already know the answer to that. The question is what you've done with that seeing, and whether what you've done is costing you more than you're willing to admit. 1. The thing about clarity. Most people assume that seeing clearly is an advantage, that if you can perceive a situation accurately, read the room, sense the tension, notice what's being avoided, you are better positioned than those who can't. And in theory, that's true. In practice, it is one of the most isolating experiences a person can have. Here's what actually happens. You walk into a family dinner, and within 30 seconds you can feel the specific shape of a conflict that everyone has agreed, wordlessly, to pretend doesn't exist. You can identify which person is performing happiness. You can feel the pressure in the room that's bending everyone's sentences into something slightly false. And you sit down, and you eat, and you participate in the performance. Because the alternative is to name what you see, and you already know what happens when you do that. You've done it before. You named the thing. And the room didn't thank you for it. The room closed around the wound like a fist, and suddenly you became the problem. Not the conflict, not the unspoken truth. You. The one who said it. The one who saw it. So you learned something that night, or one of the many nights like it. You learned that perception without permission is a social violation. That seeing something no one has agreed to see is, functionally, an act of aggression, regardless of your intention. And that is a devastating thing to learn, because it doesn't just change how you behave in rooms. It starts to change how you relate to your own mind. You begin to treat your own clarity as a liability. You start filtering your perceptions before they become words. You develop a kind of internal censor that's always asking, is this something I'm allowed to see? And the longer you do this, the more you start to lose track of what you actually perceive versus what you've decided you're permitted to. That loss, the slow erosion of trust in your own perception, is not a minor psychological event. It is the beginning of something that most people never fully name and almost never fully recover from. What did you learn to stop seeing? And when did you decide that your clarity was something to manage rather than something to follow? 2. The social contract of blindness. Every group, every family, friendship circle, workplace, to culture, operates on a set of things that are agreed not to be seen, not discussed, not named, not brought into direct light. This is not conspiracy. It is not malice. It is the basic architecture of social cohesion. Shared blindness is how groups stay intact. The anthropologist Ernest Becker wrote about how human civilization itself is built on a massive act of collective not seeing. Specifically, the refusal to look directly at mortality, at meaninglessness, at the randomness of suffering. We build elaborate systems of meaning, status, and routine precisely so we don't have to feel the weight of those things. And he argued that anyone who steps outside those systems, anyone who refuses the collective anesthetic, pays a price that the group cannot forgive. You've felt this price. Maybe not in those theoretical terms, but in the specific texture of your daily life. The colleague who goes quiet when you bring up something true about the organization. The friend who changes the subject every time the conversation gets close to something real about their relationship. The family member who treats your perception as an attack on their survival. Because functionally, it is. Their survival depends on not seeing what you're pointing at. And here is where it gets psychologically dangerous for you specifically. Because you understand this. You understand why they need the blindness. You have enough empathy, enough intelligence, enough awareness of human psychology to see why people protect their not seeing. And that understanding becomes a justification for silence. You tell yourself you're being compassionate. Soon, you tell yourself you're respecting their process. But there's something you're not admitting. Underneath the compassion, underneath the respect for their process, there is fear. Fear that if you say the real thing, you will lose them. Fear that your perception will cost you the relationship, the belonging, the warmth of being included. And so you choose the warmth, you choose the inclusion, and you swallow the perception. You've been swallowing perceptions for years. You know what that does to a person. What you may not have fully admitted is how much of what you experience as anxiety, as vague dissatisfaction, as the sense that something is fundamentally wrong with your life, is not a disorder. It is the accumulated pressure of everything you've refused to say. 3. The person you built to survive. At some point, and you can probably locate this moment if you try, even if vaguely, you made a decision. The decision was not conscious, not verbal, not something you would have been able to articulate at the time. But the decision was this: I will make myself acceptable. I will reshape my perception, my expression, my presentation of self into something that this environment can tolerate. I will build a version of me that fits. Otto Rank called this the construction of the persona, not in the superficial sense of a mask, but in the deeper sense of a whole architecture of self that is built in response to external pressure rather than internal truth. And what makes this particularly brutal is that the persona works. People respond to it warmly. You get belonging. You get approval. You get included. And then one day, you catch yourself in a quiet moment. A moment when the performance drops because no one is watching, and you feel it. The specific chill of not recognizing yourself. The strange hollowness of being alone with a version of you that you built for an audience. And no one is there to watch. And so the performance has no purpose. And without the performance, you're not sure what's left. That feeling, that specific hollow, disorienting silence, is one of the most important moments a person can have. Most people run from it immediately. They pick up the phone, turn on the television, generate noise, generate stimulus, generate something to fill the space before the silence can speak. Because the silence is asking a question they've been avoiding for a very long time. Who were you before you learned to be acceptable? Not in a romantic, poetic sense, in a precise, clinical, uncomfortable sense. Before you learned what got you warmth and what got you coldness. Before you learned which perceptions to voice and which to bury. Before you understood the social contract of blindness and decided to sign it. Who was that person? What did they see? What did they feel? And what did they need? You may find that you have very little access to the answer. That the construction project was so total, so thorough, that the original blueprints are difficult to locate. That is not a small thing. That is a psychological emergency that most people treat as a personality trait. 4. What the anxiety is actually telling you. Here is what modern psychology often gets wrong about anxiety. It treats it as a malfunction, as noise in the system, as something to be managed, reduced, quieted. And there are certainly forms of anxiety that are, neurologically, disproportionate. Responses that have been calibrated wrong by trauma or biology. That's real. That matters. But there is another kind of anxiety. The kind that Kierkegaard described as the dizziness of freedom. That is not a malfunction at all. It is the nervous system's accurate report on a situation that is genuinely unresolved. It is the psyche's signal that something important is being avoided. And when you treat this kind of anxiety as a problem to be eliminated, rather than a message to be decoded, you do something very specific. You silence the one part of you that is still telling the truth. Think about when your anxiety is most intense. Not in the abstract, but in the specific texture of your actual days. Notice the pattern. The anxiety does not appear randomly. It appears at the edges of decisions you've been postponing. It appears when you're about to say something true and you swallow it. It appears when you spend time with people who require you to perform a version of yourself that doesn't fit. It appears when you are closest to something that matters and most committed to pretending it doesn't. Your anxiety is not random. It is directional. It is pointing at something. And the question is not how to make it stop. The question is whether you are willing to look at what it's pointing at. Rank wrote that neurosis, what we would now loosely call anxiety and depression, and the whole architecture of psychological suffering, is not the result of too much feeling. It is the result of the war between feeling and the refusal to feel. But the suffering is not the emotion itself. The suffering is the suppression. The cost is not in the perception. The cost is in the years spent managing the perception rather than living from it. What would happen if you stopped managing it? Not in a reckless, burn everything down sense. In the quiet, private sense of simply letting yourself know what you know. 5. The loneliness that doesn't have a name. There is a loneliness specific to people who perceive deeply, and it is different from ordinary loneliness in a way that makes it harder to address. Ordinary loneliness has an obvious solution. Find people, build connection, reduce isolation. But this other loneliness, the loneliness of seeing what others don't, is not solved by proximity. You can be in a room full of people who love you and feel it completely. Because it is not the loneliness of being without people. It is the loneliness of being without witnesses. The loneliness of having no one around who will see what you see and say, "Yes, that's real. I see it too." The loneliness of carrying perceptions that have no one to receive them. Of having an inner life that is too large for the conversations available to you. Most people who feel this loneliness do one of two things. The first is that they contract. They reduce their inner life to fit the conversations available. They become smaller, quieter, more manageable. They perform depth only in safe, sanctioned contexts. They tell themselves this is maturity. It is not maturity. It is surrender. The second thing people do is they find one person, one single person, and they pour everything into that relationship. Every unwitnessed perception, every suppressed truth, every part of themselves that has had nowhere to go. They make that person responsible for receiving all of it. And that relationship buckles under the weight. Not because the love isn't real, because no single human being can carry the entire accumulated loneliness of a person who has been without witnesses for decades. Neither of these strategies works, and you probably know this. And you probably haven't found a third option yet, or you found it partially and then retreated from it. Because the third option requires something that feels genuinely dangerous. It requires letting yourself be seen, accurately, without editing, without managing the other person's response, by at least one person in your life. Not performing depth, actually being in it, and trusting that what they see won't destroy what you have. That trust is the hardest thing, because the evidence of your life has often suggested it isn't safe. 6. The identity built on being misunderstood. Now this is the part that's going to be uncomfortable, because there is a version of this experience, the experience of seeing what others don't, of being without witnesses, of carrying perceptions that the world isn't ready for, that becomes its own kind of trap. A trap that feels like depth, but functions like avoidance. Some people, after years of being misunderstood, stop trying to be understood. And on the surface, this looks like acceptance, like peace, like finally not needing external validation. But underneath it, something else is happening. They begin to organize their identity around being misunderstood. The misunderstanding becomes the evidence of their depth. The isolation becomes the proof of their perception. And the thought of actually being seen, fully, accurately, by someone who gets it, starts to feel threatening rather than relieving. Because if you are understood, then the story changes. The story that has been organizing your inner life. I see what no one else sees. I feel what no one else feels. I am fundamentally alone in my perception of reality. That story loses its function. And the loss of that story, even when the story is painful, is experienced as a loss of self. Otto Rank described this as one of the deepest human contradictions. We claim to want connection, to want to be understood, to want to be seen. And simultaneously, we arrange our lives so that true understanding is never quite achieved. When we keep ourselves slightly out of reach, we manage the distance. We protect the story of our own unknowability. Ask yourself honestly, have you ever, in a moment of potential real connection, done something to break it? Said something that closed the door? Retreated into irony or complexity at the moment when simplicity was available? Decided at the last second that this person wasn't quite enough to deserve the real version of you? What if the problem wasn't that they weren't enough? What if the problem was that being received is, at a deep level, terrifying? 7. The cost of being right all the time. There is a specific psychological defense that develops in people who have been dismissed, who have been told their perception was wrong or excessive or inconvenient, and who were later proven right. And the defense is this: they become invested in being right. Not just accurate, right. There is a difference. Being accurate means you're attending to reality carefully and your read of the situation corresponds to what's actually there. Being right means you need your perception to be validated, to be confirmed, to be acknowledged by the people who previously dismissed it. Being right is not about truth. It is about the wound that was created when your truth was rejected. And this investment in being right does something insidious to perception. It makes you less accurate, not more. Because when you need to be right, you stop being a reader of reality and become an advocate for a position. You start noticing the evidence that confirms your read and sliding past the evidence that complicates it. You become, in a very precise way, the mirror image of the people who dismissed you, someone who has decided what reality is and is now filtering perception through that decision. The person who needed you to be wrong was protecting their story. You have built a story too, and your story, like theirs, is costing you access to what's actually happening. This is perhaps the most difficult thing to look at, because the investment in being right is not vanity. It is not arrogance. It is the scar tissue around a real wound. You needed to be right, because being wrong, being told your perception was wrong, was at some point a threat to your sense of reality, your trust in your own mind, possibly your sense of safety. Being right became the way you held yourself together. But you're not in that situation anymore, and the defense is still running. And it is keeping you from seeing something important about your current life. What is it? 8. What you've been avoiding seeing about yourself. You've probably been watching this whole video from a very particular position. The position of someone who relates to the material through their experience of other people. Other people's blindness. Other people's defenses. Other people's investment in not seeing. And that position is comfortable. It keeps the analysis pointing outward. But there is something you've been not seeing about yourself. Something that your own social contract of blindness has kept in the periphery. Something that your constructed persona was specifically designed to keep out of frame. It won't be the same thing for everyone watching this. But here is the shape of it. It is usually something about the gap between who you perform yourself to be and what you actually want. Something about the direction your life is moving versus the direction your deepest perception of yourself suggests it should be going. Something about the relationship you're in, or the work you're doing, or the version of your future you've agreed to pursue, and the quiet, persistent, daily sense that it isn't quite right. You perceive this. Clearly, probably. You have perceived it for some time, and you have developed an elaborate and sophisticated set of reasons why acting on that perception isn't possible, isn't responsible, isn't fair to the people around you. The reasons are real. The constraints are real. The obligations are real. But underneath the reasons, underneath the constraints, underneath the obligations, there is something simpler. There is fear. And the fear is not that you can't change. The fear is that you can. That you have more freedom than your current story allows for. And that using that freedom would require you to see yourself differently. To stop being the person whose circumstances prevent them from living honestly and become the person who chose this. Or chooses differently. That is a level of responsibility most people never fully pick up, because it is easier to be limited by your circumstances than to be free within them. 9. The people who need you not to see this one is important, because part of what makes changing, part of what makes beginning to live from your actual perception rather than the managed version so difficult is that there are people in your life whose stability depends on you not doing that. Not out of malice, out of need. There are people around you, possibly people you love deeply, whose sense of themselves, whose story about their lives, whose ability to maintain the version of reality they've organized around, requires that you continue to be who you've been, requires that you continue to see what you've agreed to see and not see what you've agreed not to see. When you begin to change, these people will not celebrate it. They will express concern. They will tell you you've changed, as if that is a warning. They will wonder if you're okay, if something is wrong, if you've been influenced by something unhealthy. They will do this with love, often, with genuine worry. And the love will be real, and the worry will also be a form of pressure, a gentle, caring, completely sincere pressure to return to who you were. Rank wrote that individuation, the process of becoming genuinely yourself rather than a social construction, is experienced by the group as abandonment. Not because you are abandoning anyone, but because your departure from the shared story makes the shared story visible as a story. And that visibility is threatening to everyone who needs the story to be real. You will have to decide what you owe these people. That is not a question this video can answer. But here is something worth sitting with. You cannot actually give them what they need by staying small. You can give them the comfort of your continued smallness. That is a different thing. 10. The thing that sees. There is something in you that has been watching all of this. Watching you perform. Watching you manage your perception. Watching you choose comfort over clarity. Belonging over truth. The warmth of the group over the cold freedom of your own mind. It has been watching without judgment, or maybe with judgment, but without the ability to change anything. It is the part of you that sees what others don't, and it has also been seeing what you don't want to see about yourself. Rank called this the will, not willpower in the motivational sense, but the deep organizing force of the self, the thing that is most fundamentally you, underneath the persona, underneath the defenses, underneath the story you've built to survive. He believed that psychological health was not the absence of conflict, but the capacity to live from this will honestly, to bring the person you actually are into contact with the life you're actually living, without the constant mediation of fear. Most people live their entire lives at one remove from this. They live through the persona, through the managed version, through the performance, and they experience reality as slightly muted, slightly gray, slightly off in a way they can't quite name. And they develop theories about what's wrong. They try various adjustments. They optimize the performance. They improve the persona. And the grayness persists, because the grayness is not a problem with the performance. It is the cost of the performance itself. Seeing what others don't is not the problem. It never was. The problem is what you've done with that seeing. The problem is that you've allowed it to become a source of isolation rather than a basis for an authentic life. The problem is that you've been using your perception to understand everyone around you while systematically refusing to direct that same clear, uncompromising gaze at yourself. You know what you've been avoiding. You've known for longer than you've admitted. And it is not waiting for you to be ready. It has been waiting for you to be honest. There is no resolution at the end of this. No framework, no method, no practical steps that make what has been said easier to carry. Because the truth is that seeing clearly, actually seeing, without the editing, without the social contract of blindness, without the management of your own perception, is not a skill to be developed. It is a willingness to be disturbed. A willingness to let what is real be real, even when what is real is inconvenient, even when it costs you the comfort of the story you've built, even when it asks something of you that you don't yet know how to give. Otto Rank believed that the deepest human fear was not death. It was the fear of living, fully exposed, without the armor of the constructed self, and being insufficient. Being too much and not enough at the same time. Being precisely, uncomfortably, unavoidably yourself. You already see what others don't. The question that will stay with you after this video ends, the question you'll carry into the silence, is whether you're finally willing to see what you do.